Hi there, John Coombs here again from Global Health and Beat Fatigue. Today I want to talk about the general themes of well-being and happiness and vitality. And there's this whole difference between life and living, and the whole issue around lifestyle balance and happiness and purpose, all the things that bring us the deeper sense of satisfaction and well-being, survival. Just this basic aspect of survival. So what is it that makes a human being a human being? Well, of course, we have a biological nature, and we share 99.9% the same DNA biologically as human beings. And yet, if you look at the difference between human beings, there's an enormous gulf in the difference between really high-achieving, happy, purposeful, satisfied people and people who can't get out of bed, people who are having operations every few months to stay alive on very, very heavy drug regimes, needing a lot of care and living a lot of dependency. And yet they share 99.9% the same DNA. So obviously there's a bigger difference than just DNA. All this comes down to things like attitudes and beliefs and the quality of relationships and just the quality of hope and purpose that people have in their life. Now these are things that, if we're fortunate enough to have very encouraging parents and parents who put a lot of time and effort into us, life's made me a lot easier. I was one of those people. I was very, very heavily encouraged by both my parents and groups of grandparents and things like that. Did it mean I took that for granted? And I look back on that now and think, ooh, boy, really so heavily took it for granted. I got myself into a lot of trouble as a teenager, as a young man, because I just thought everybody had those opportunities within reason. And then as I went through life, I started to realize they didn't. And I wanted to understand, well, why are other people so different? And why do people grow up without hope and violence and drugs and crime and things like that? So I wanted to investigate and explore another side of life for a little while, and it didn't go very well, and it caused trouble for myself and other people, but I learned a lot in the process. Now, if we go back to some of the great teachers of history, people like Buddha and Jesus, I just use as an example, who left behind teaching systems and value systems and well-being systems followed by billions of people thousands of years later, it's obvious that what they left behind was something very, very, very valuable. Now, Buddhism is not a religion, it's a lifestyle system and a philosophy, and it's not based on a God as a personal God. It's based on a different way of looking at life from the average Western perspective, based on a middle path. And some of the genesis for that middle path comes from Buddha being born as a prince and his father wanting to protect him from suffering so that he stayed pure to his role as a prince and not wanting to leave and go and explore the world in different ways. And then Buddha discovered some suffering by accident and thought, oh my goodness, what on earth's this? And he went as a wandering seeker and then started to live on 1 grain of rice a day as an ascetic. And that's a super version of fasting. And in his journey seeking out the great teachers of his region, he developed an insight that there was a middle path by which we can alleviate suffering. So to some extent, so Buddhism very much teaches a way to alleviate suffering through a middle path and not being attached to outcomes, which when they don't work out the way we want them to, will lead to a lot of disappointment. I'm not promoting this as the only way. I'm not promoting this as the way. I'm just saying it's a tested system that's been used by billions of people over several thousand years as a way of helping people alleviate suffering and avoiding some of the biggest problems associated with life. And we have the teachings. Buddha had his own levels of suffering, and part of this is we can never be truly at peace while suffering exists in the world. In other words, once we become more developed within ourselves and we've worked out how to look after ourselves without a lot of challenges, and we start to think, well, I want to do more and I want to be able to help other people. And we look around us and we see a lot of suffering, and that creates anxiety. It's all very well for people, older people like me, who've been a grandparent for many years, who have grandchildren at university. And I've just been talking to a 20-year-old about, is there much hope in her generation? The answer was not particularly. Now, this leaves somebody like me, who's a baby boomer, with a degree of apprehension that my generation needs to do more to help younger generations. Because my generation was gifted a tremendous amount of asset and wealth by our foremothers, and we've been a little bit extravagant with it and profligate. And so we haven't left the world necessarily a much better place. There's less poverty, there's more availability of water, there's more food than there's ever been. There's more ability to travel and whatnot. But there's also a whole new range of diseases, modern diseases and 21st century diseases. And it's hard to say, in my opinion, there's probably less hope in the community than there was when I was young. The media, whose job it is as a business is to sell advertising or to fund its activities, has really specialised in providing, a principle: if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, bad news is good for business. So whether that's Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, or whether it's the TV news and Fox News, there's a tremendous amount of extravagant information going into people's brains that's not enhancing their well-being. So this is very much, there's been media for a long time now. When I was young, my parents would watch the TV news at 6 o'clock or 6:30, whenever it was. And they'd often watch that for a whole hour, and that shaped the way they thought to some extent. Now, we had library and we had books and history books and books on psychology and child psychology. I came from a well-educated family and people who cared a lot about leaving a good world behind. But this type of media, and some of it being propaganda, wasn't necessarily good for the way it shaped the values of my family at certain stages. One of the things that was shaped in the family was the doctor knows about health. So when I was young, doctors did know more about health than they do now, but they knew less about disease. There's a very big difference there, because what shapes health? Well, being happy is a version of health. Being energetic is a version of health. Having healthy relationships is a version of health. Very positive psychology is a version of health. Getting good quality exercise is a version of health. And doctors and GPs don't study this stuff. They study diseases. So if we will transpose this into the country with the biggest health budget in the world, and this is America, where the American health budget in American dollars is about $4.3 million a year, and that's the equivalent, that's just the health and human services budget. That's the equivalent of being the 8th biggest economy in the world. In other words, there's 7 countries in the world with a bigger economy than they spend on health in America, and that's all. 7 countries with a bigger economy than what they spend on health and human services just through the government in America. That's not the private spend. That's not all the money spent in insurance, private insurance policies. That's not all the people taking vitamins and minerals and doing specialised private care. That's just the government's central government budget. And yet 77% of Americans won't pass the test to join the military. In other words, it's quite conceivable that Americans have never been less healthy at a chronic disease level than they are now. Probably at least 2/3 of Americans have a chronic disease. But if only 23% can pass the military test, then a host more than those 2/3 are going to have some other disease stopping them being accepted by the military. So it's obvious that what is being promoted through the mainstream medical system in countries like America is absolutely 100% not working. It's obvious that the food that's being promoted in America, the fast and convenient food, is not working. It's obviously the agricultural system is not working, because it's something like 97% of the food in America is reliant on glyphosate, and this does enormous damage to the quality of the microbiome of the soil, and the soil is immensely important for the health of our planet and the health of our rivers and the health of the quality of our food, the nutrients that go into our food, and the stabilization of climate, and a whole host of other aspects about human and planetary health. And if 97% of the food is relying on a chemical that damages the soil and dehydrates the soil and kills off a lot of the biota of the soil, not only is the food being compromised, but so is the general environment. So it's hardly surprising that young people now are feeling not a huge amount of hope about the future, because they don't have the qualifications to change that. They don't have the qualifications to know how to be completely healthy and well, and they don't necessarily even have the qualifications to know who to listen to on Instagram or watch on Instagram and listen to on TikTok. So it really comes back to the older generations taking a lot more responsibility and being a lot more wise and considerate and compassionate passionate about the future of humanity and the ability of younger people to trust older generations and to trust a health system that knows what it's doing and to feel confident about their future, confident to have children, confident to bring new people into the world. Science is the foundation. Science means understanding, and again, this enormous budget that's funding medical science is failing dramatically in America and exporting that science to countries like New Zealand and many European countries and all over the world. It's obviously we have to change. We have to change a lot of the science that's being promoted. We have to change a lot of the education. We have to change the way people are being trained. We have to change the way people are being raised by their families and their parents. These changes need to happen quite radically because we're experiencing a future shock. Now, I first came across a book in about 1973 called Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. And in those days, the world was moving reasonably quickly compared to the way it was for my parents. But compared to the world we live in today, it was no comparison at all. The world I grew up with, it would take 6 days to fly from New Zealand to Europe, and now you can be there the next day, easily. Whichever way you go, whether you go east or west, you can be from New Zealand to England the following day. So the pace of the world has improved, the convenience of food, the convenience of water, the convenience of energy and shelter and things like that has improved dramatically, but the quality of life, according to most indices, for people in the developed world has deteriorated. People's confidence has deteriorated, the economy in the developed world, the balance between the wealthy and the not wealthy has deteriorated, and parts of the middle class seem to be disappearing from the developed world. The rich are getting richer and a lot of other people are struggling. New Zealand's a country where it seems to be harder for people to buy a house than it used to be. It's never been 100% easy to buy a house, but it seems to be harder now. So whichever way we look at it, this change that I'm talking about becomes more and more necessary and more dramatic. And change is ideally going to take place with some wisdom behind it, with some intelligence behind it, with a degree of will behind it, and ideally with an integration of all those three. Ideally, we can change for the positive based on, courage, determination, knowing where we're going, and doing it in a way that's going to be good for the future of the world, not just that we're going to get richer or we're going to get healthier over the back of other people. So there's a skill that comes into this, and there's an experience that comes into it. There's a degree of knowing where to find the way to navigate our way towards this well-being, this vitality, this happiness, this feeling of satisfaction that I'm living the life I want to live and I'm living it amongst other people who have that same feeling. Now, this is quite rare. It's not that difficult for an individual to find this for themselves. But that, like we're talking about with Buddha, once you start to look around and see suffering around you, it's like, oh, well, I really want to help, I want to contribute. That's where it becomes more challenging, because just simply to survive as a human being is not that difficult. We've got social services, we've got social systems, we've got all sorts of systems available to us to help us survive. People in countries like New Zealand are living around about 80 plus years. But I spoke to a 75-year-old today who's been fit and determined for his whole life. Since I've known him for about 25 or so years, I've watched him have probably 10 different operations, and I know he had lots before that. He's 75 now, and today he's saying, I'm going off for another operation. Now, him and his wife spend $1,600 a month on health insurance, and what that's providing for him is an enormous amount of surgery. But is it providing him with well-being? Should he need operations? Well, that's a debatable question. The last operation I had was in 1963, and I would hope that's the last operation I ever have. It remains to be seen. I could have a car accident, and that could lead to some need to be for surgery. But at this stage, I'm trying to live my life in a way that I don't need surgery. And I've been advised to have surgery a number of times and decided not to. So some of this from sports injuries, and I've chosen a different way. I initially was educated, as I said, my parents really encouraged me to learn. I went to university, I studied quantum physics, clear physics, calculus, algebra, chemistry, advanced and difficult sciences. And when you start to study some of these sciences, you start to realize the way the average person looks at the world, especially when you start to study quantum physics or study light or study electrons, which are just basic aspects of modern physics. You realize that most people don't think about the universe the way the universe truly exists. And most of the medical system doesn't apply proper modern physics, tried and tested modern physics. Because if I was to look at it from a perspective of a physicist, like a pure physicist, a human being's body runs on electrons and photons, light particles. A human being photosynthesizes, and our body is a carrier system, in particular the water in our body, of electrons and photons. But that's not how most people think. Most people think from a more reductionist perspective, and they think about chemistry. Now, if you look at the hierarchy of sciences, mathematics is a pure science that would just attempt to explain the whole universe, and not just in terms of numbers and adding numbers up as a linear perspective, but in a perspective of geometry. The shapes and the field maths, the way in which energy aggregates either into a coherence or an incoherence. Now, from a human being's perspective, energy aggregating into coherence is what I would call well-being. That will lead to a lot of vitality and cellular activity that functions at a very high level. That will lead to a coherence of our emotional nature, coherence of our mental nature, a coherence of our relationships, etc., etc. And you can look at this, and we often have words to describe coherence. One of them is beauty. Leonardo da Vinci, who's probably the most famous painter in history, and has painted the most famous painting. He was a man who studied the type of maths I'm talking about now, and the way in which the various mathematical formulae like the golden mean or the Fibonacci series integrate into our life. They integrate into every single plant on the planet. They integrate into human beings. They integrate into our musculoskeletal system and the ratios between the joints in our fingers, or between this part of our arm and that part of our arm, or our leg or our face. They integrate into our DNA, the length of the DNA compared to the width of the DNA, and that's measured in very tiny measurements, angstroms. They integrate even right the way down into one single molecule of water, and the length of the bond between the hydrogen and the oxygen and the other hydrogen and the oxygen. So our whole body is coded by this mathematics. Water is influenced by this mathematics, and water is the dominant chemical in our body. It's the dominant chemical on the planet. It's the dominant chemical in our body. Water is an extremely small molecule, one of the smallest molecules, only got 10 protons, whereas DNA has billions in one molecule. So you start to see if we can get this mathematical coherence into our primary chemical, which is water. And we've known for a long time now, whether it was Jesus, Buddha, or a whole host of early teachers, right the way through to modern teachers, that water carries information. Not just chemical information, but emotional information. It carries mental information, and it can carry what we call spiritual information. We want to use words like spiritual or quantum, if we want to take it from just a purely academic scientific perspective. And it's been tested that water can carry this information and change within a trillionth of a second. One of the easiest and cheapest and most simplistic ways of measuring this maths in the water is to freeze the water. So water, which is again this carrier of life, whether it's the biology of plants, animals, or humans, water's the staff. Water is the information and circulation system that can carry information through blood, through lymphatic systems, or even at a quantum level. And one of the things we do in this clinic is we analyze blood. We analyze live blood. We'll take it from a finger prick. Now, we're not allowed to say this is we have to use special language how we define what we're doing with this blood, which is taken from 2 drops from the fingertip and blown up under a microscope, and we blow it up in different ways, and then we dry it. and then we'll take individual photographs, shots of the photographs. But in the early stage, you can see the blood floating across the computer screen. You can see what your blood looks like. Now, going back to the maths again, a healthy blood cell will look like a beautiful circle of blood. A lot of the unhealthy blood cells can be joined together and clumped together. So let's just say a healthy blood cell looks like a nice ripe grape with a nice skin, smooth skin and a good quality skin, whereas an unhealthy blood cell will look like a raisin, sticky and clumped together necessarily. And many people with blood looks like this. Now, this is a form of maths, it's a form of physics, it's a form of chemistry, it's a form of biology. So the blood integrates across a wide spectrum of science. But we could have a 5-year-old determine the difference between healthy blood assessed under a microscope and unhealthy blood, and we can probably teach them that in about 30 seconds. And they'll be able to identify healthy blood over and over and over again compared to unhealthy blood. Now, the average man will have about 35 million blood cells. The average woman about 25 million blood cells. So you start to see this is a fairly important thing to be able to understand. Most of the people I've ever met in my life have never seen their blood live under a microscope. And yet this would seem to be one of the most basic ways of being able to assess incredibly quickly and inexpensively the health and well-being of a human being. I'm wondering why this is not more freely available, why this is not being promoted. Now, we're not able to say, because this blood is like this, you have this particular disease. That's not what we're doing. What we're able to do is show you from a mathematical likelihood, a nice round circle of blood is very likely to travel through the over 100,000 kilometers of blood vessels in your body much more easily than blood that doesn't look like a circle, just like a car where a piston will be going up and down inside a motor. Now you only need a tiny little interference in the circle of that piston inside a cylinder, and it's going to cause quite a lot of problems for a motor. In exactly the same way, if the blood is traveling over 100,000 kilometers with the blood vessels, and the average heart is beating about 100,000 times a day, doesn't take long to understand that things can start to go quite seriously wrong if the blood's not healthy. And it's not that hard to be able to determine that just with a simple imaging. And again, we're now going back to geometry and mathematics, because a circle is a very symmetrical shape, but a raisin is a not particularly symmetrical shape. So blood is 93% chemical water, going back to water again. It's also a lot of other nutrients, and the quality of those nutrients is going to have a huge impact on the quality of our health. So to summarize again, I've said that there's over 100,000 kilometers, not meters, kilometers of blood vessels in the average human body. Most of them are thinner than a hair. Most of them can only carry one single blood cell in single file. We're not talking about big highways like these blood or the aorta, which is carrying like a big highway with an 8-lane highway. We're talking about the type of little lanes that would go into your garage, 1-lane roads, country sort of roads, where only one blood cell at a time is going in a single file. Now, the blood is delivering nutrition to our cells. We've done tests inside our clinic going back to some of the science I've been talking about before in terms of quantum physics, which becomes quantum psychology in the field of health, or quantum biology, which are very much modern ways of looking at life. This is not reductionist science. This is not pure chemistry. This is a quantum dynamic, and I've already talked about how water can change within a trillionth of a second, not at a chemical level but at an electrical level. So we have done tests inside the clinic where we can help people change the nature or the expression of their blood within half an hour to an hour. So we've got numerous before and after tests of blood that looks extremely unhealthy, which is likely to be causing a lot of combination of heart disease and a range of all sorts of other illnesses, through to blood that's almost certainly going to lead to you feeling a lot healthier, a lot more positive about your future because you've got more vitality, because your blood's looking healthier. Now the problem with those changes that can happen very easily is you've got to be able to sustain them. If you're going to have 100,000 heartbeats a day and your blood being pushed out through over 100,000 kilometers of blood vessels 100,000 times a day for 80 years, there's a lot of maintenance involved in this. So that is what presents a lot of the challenge to the average person, because a lot of people can be healthy for a few days. We can help people energy improve from 1 out of 10 to 7 out of 10 very, very easily in a month. But will people maintain the type of program and continue to fund the activities and the requirements to maintain that energy level of 70% day in, day out for 80 years? That's the big challenge people have. It's very, very easy to help people get well. It's not that easy to help people stay well, because by nature we want to take shortcuts. And I've been one of those people. I've had 4 near-death experiences in my life, and that's very radical. I understand that, but that's the way I lived my life as a young person. I took a lot of risks, and I realized, hey, I'm experimenting with myself. It's my life. I'm entitled to experiment with myself. The problem with that is once I started to have a lot more children, my responsibilities increased, and it was very, very important for me to stay a lot more healthy and well. So being the age I am now, I have a real vested interest. I started to realize, okay, if I only live the average lifespan, no way I'm going to finish the sort of projects and the purpose I have for my life in that 80-year lifespan. That would only leave me another 10 years or so alive. Now having to sort of think much more serious about living a lot longer than I ever did previously. Now when I was young and in the rock and roll type world, I couldn't even see being 30. Even when I was about 27, I couldn't even see being 30. I couldn't see into the future very well. Now, I can only see so well into the future now, but what I can see is if I live long enough and I'm healthy enough, I can help other people in the process. Now, we've worked with about 11,000 clients through our clinic, and everything from the most seriously ill people with things like stage 4 cancer and facing heart surgery, widowmaker type heart surgery, you name it, the diseases that come through, and many people have multiple cancers, and many of them are stage 4. Now, we're not allowed to cure cancer in the clinic. We're not allowed to claim that we do, and we don't claim to do any of that. What we do claim to do is to try and help people take some of the fundamental steps and get some of the fundamental building blocks to health and well-being established in their daily lifestyle. Eating good quality food, thinking good quality thoughts, having beliefs that have some degree of substance behind them and meaning behind them, having relationships that are far more healthy than less healthy, exercising enough, good quality sleep, understanding how their hormones work so they can actually feed themselves a type of food that's going to grow good hormones and good nerves, just having some basic understanding of their health and well-being. The way which we try to achieve this is we try to do good quality tests. I've already talked about the blood test, and we'll show some images of that. We're using, again, when I talked about physics in the past, what separates a lot of the work we do in this clinic compared to a lot of other places is we look at science from very much a physics and maths-based level, far more than a chemistry-based level. So we use a lot of light therapy. Now, let's talk about light in a human being. So we've understood for a long time, and I studied this well over 60 years ago at school, photosynthesis. We studied that a plant will be absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere and water from the roots, and that would be photosynthesizing into a sugar or a carbohydrate. CO2 plus H2O equals carbohydrate or sugar. Human beings are very different to plants. So a plant is mainly water, part of its circulation system, and sugar, carbohydrates. When a plant desiccates, it becomes a hydrocarbon, it becomes an energy system, and that's what we use, oil and coal and things like that from plants. Now we're shifting to human beings. Human beings are mainly water and protein. What's the difference between sugar and protein? Well, there's an enormous difference if you want to be healthy as a human being. Human beings mainly water and protein, and the reason that human beings are needing protein helps to grow nerves. Protein is the building blocks of DNA. Protein helps to develop muscles, strong muscles, active muscles. Protein helps to grow hormones. And what runs our body at a fundamental level is the nervous system and the hormones. They run the organs, and they run a communication system throughout our body to ensure that the information from the brain, in and out of the brain, is going through the body coherently to keep the body healthy and well, to run our musculoskeletal system, to run the various systems of the body. So if we need protein for our nerves and protein for our hormones, it would make common sense that protein is very important, especially if we need it for our muscles as well. especially if our DNA is made of protein. Even more than this, the body requires protein for enzymatic activity, for the enzymes, and it's the enzymes that are helping to run a lot of our body. So what does an enzyme do, or why would an enzyme be important? Because the food we eat has to be converted from basic raw ingredients of organisms. They're plants or animals that are much more primitive than a human being. None of them, to my knowledge, can use computers, drive cars, right? A lot of the complex technology that human beings do, have complex language systems, fly aeroplanes, drive boats, etc., etc. So human beings run an immensely complex life compared to the other organisms. And here we are trying to convert the nutrients from, say, a sheep or a cow, or those who are vegetarians, from a nut, a seed, or a plant, into a complex hormone system, a complex DNA system, complex nervous system, complex musculoskeletal system, capable of doing advanced gymnastics, playing tennis, driving a car at 300 kilometers an hour, etc., etc. How does it happen? It's the enzymes that are helping to convert a lot of the raw ingredients from a nut, say an almond, or a soybean, or some avocado, or a piece of spinach, or some muscle out of a cow, say, into these complex biological systems that we rely on to live our life. Most of the people I've tested are not doing a good job of metabolizing or synthesizing the nutrition they eat into a vital, healthy body. Now, this is a really big issue. I'm talking now well over 50% of the people that I test day in, day out. Now, how accurate is the test? Well, we think the test is very accurate, but what do we do to correlate that? Well, one of the things we do is we check before and after how people are progressing with their programs, protocols, and consistently people gain energy from doing the work we do. Consistently they feel less pain, consistently they digest their food better, consistently they have more mobility, consistently they go to the toilet more easily, etc., etc., etc. Consistently they feel more confident, less moody, less ADHD, less anxiety, less depression. So we know from a practical before and after that it works. We also know by testing the blood, because the blood's, the eyes are coded to see things that are true or untrue quite quickly and easily. And if the blood improves from looking like a raisin to looking like a free grape quite quickly, well, we know we're on the right track as well. So everything from subject to object about whether we're on the right track or not. So the enzyme activity in a human body is ignored by most people. Now the problem with the enzyme activity is stress is not good for most people's bodies. Now I know athletes are trained to operate at stress, and I know executives and busy mums and stuff have to train themselves to multitask and operate under stress all the time. But if we're going to operate under stress all the time, we have to have the functions of our body working very, very well. And this is where sports science is one of the most valuable forms of medicine. And this is an area that myself and our clinic have really put a lot of effort into. I wanted to be a top athlete when I was young, and I was very keen, and I was very, very interested in being a really, really good athlete in the field that I was interested in. I stopped at a very young age because I just, I got into the rock and roll type of world, and sport really wasn't big in that sort of world. But I knew that what I needed to do as a young person was get a lot of building blocks in place to succeed in that area, because the thing about sport, there's a score to measure your success, there's boundaries, there's timelines, there's umpires, there's rules. So it's quite an easy way to measure success. And there's an enormous amount of difference between the very best and just an average beginner. Enormous degrees of progression involved. So what do these top sports people have to do to be successful like that consistently for, say, 10 years? They've got to get their blood healthy. They've got to get the energy to be able to sustain their activity. They've got to have flexibility. They have to have a psychology that can cope with stress. The best of them understand EQ, emotional intelligence. Most of these top people, when they're being interviewed, show a lot of gratitude. They show a lot of respect for their family and the support teams behind them. They show a lot of gratitude. They show a lot of respect for their opponents. They've got a very high level of EQ. They're trained into that EQ, just like they're trained to have their muscles functioning properly. So it's no coincidence that these athletes have these types of positive psychology and these attitudes, these beliefs, this gracious way of handling victory or defeat. So sports science has taught us a lot, not just about the physiology, but the psychology and the emotional well-being aspects, because some of these athletes are just consistently succeeding against all the known odds. LeBron James, Novak Djokovic, Cristiano Ronaldo. What do they have in common? They all tend to do the same things. They all are using oxygen therapies. They're using recovery therapies, like rest and relaxation therapies. Their nutrition's very advanced. So these people are paying a lot of money for science that is obviously providing them with a very high level of well-being. So I'd like to carry on this a step further, because I've obviously been very heavily influenced by sports science and some of the tests I do and some of the hyperbaric oxygen chamber or some of the light therapy systems or the recovery systems we use to get the muscles and the nerves working better, or the electrons flowing through the body more easily. The technology and the protocols we use are being actively used by a lot of the top athletes of the world to recover from injury or to grow stronger muscles, etc., stronger nerves, stronger blood supply, etc. So what I'd like to do is follow this up in the next podcast, because in summary, well-being is a combination of a range of different activities. And one of the handouts we do here, we have a wheel of well-being. 7 different aspects to this. It's a good reason there's 7, but I won't go into that now. I'd like to follow on this because there's just so much we could say around this, but we'll keep this simple in the meantime. Thank you very much. John Coombs here, and I work for Global Health Clinics, and I also run an organisation called Beat Fatigue, which is with a view to helping you overcome fatigue and have vitality, energy and confidence. Thank you.